Hi, we are still working through chapter 5. We are in the 4th video, and in this video we're going to go through 57 slides 57 through 66. So we're going to be talking about characteristics of most tissues, or things that we're going to see over and over again that you want to become acquainted with. So there are 4 different characteristics that we'll talk about in this video. That is cell junctions, basement membrane, glands, and the membranes. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started by pulling up our slides. Okay, so cell junctions. I have said, that tissues are groups of cells that are together, working together for a specific function. So that means that we have to have the cells stuck together. So wherever cells come together, we call those cell junctions. We're going to see cell junctions really easily in epithelia, but we've already talked about one specific type of cell junction, which was the intercalated disc in the cardiac muscle. So the cell junctions are going to happen at the cell membranes. So right at the cell membranes, there are going to be proteins that are going to come out of the cell membrane and then hold hands to create a junction. There are 4 different types of cell junctions that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about tight junctions, gap junctions, desmosomes, and hemidesmosomes. Tight junctions do exactly what they said, tight junctions. So they form between cells, they bring the cells as close together as possible, and they create a seam so that nothing can go from one side of the cell to the other side of the cell. So if it's like this together, nothing can go from here to here. Okay, so a tight junction does not allow for transport across that surface. The gap junction we've talked about with cardiac muscle, the gap junction is like a tube or a straw that connects cells, and specifically connects the cytoplasms. So that means that anything on one side of the cell in the cytoplasm can move across to the other cell. So that's a gap junction, and we've seen that in the cardiac muscles. A desmosome is going to be a loose connection between 2 cells, and it's loose and it's going to allow that tissue to move and to stretch a little bit. It's not trying to stop transport from one side to the other. What it's trying to do is just hold things together so that they don't fall apart. And then hemidesmosomes are going to be found in epithelial tissue primarily, and it's going to be a tight junction at the basement membrane to keep those cells tightly put together. So if we look at these pictures right here, the first picture is the tight junction. So the cell membranes here are yellow, and then you've got the funny S curve, which are the cell adhesion proteins. So these are the proteins sticking out of the membrane and making a tight connection. So you see that nothing can cross this and go from one side to the other. So it's a very tight transport limiting junction. This is a picture of a desmosome. The desmosome is a lot looser, and there's a lot more space. You can see that I could probably wiggle in and out to get from one side to the other. Remember, the desmosome is there just to hold things together so that they don't fall apart and allow for some stretch and some wiggle. This is a gap junction. The gap junction is going to be like a tube that's between one cell and the other. I think this picture over here is better. So the gap junction is basically a channel from one cell to the other that totally allows for transport between the 2 cells. And then the last type on this picture is the hemidesmosome. The hemidesmosome are going to be down here, and they're going to be holding the epithelial cell, really tightly to the basement membrane below. So we have 4 different types of cell adhesion proteins, cell adhesions. We've got tight junction, desmosome, gap junction, and hemidesmosome, and each one has a different function. So you should be able to look at this picture on the right, and you should be able to label those 4 different types of junctions in this picture. And then you should also be able to describe them and also to say what their different functions are. The second characteristic we're going to talk about with tissues is the basement membrane. So the basement membrane is going to be where the epithelial tissue connects to the connective tissue. So we have epithelial tissue on top and connective tissue on the bottom. So here in this picture, this is my epithelial tissue. This is my connective tissue. This brown area is my basement membrane. So the basement membrane is going to be like a thick glue that is holding the epithelial cells to the connective tissue. Below, the basement membrane is split into two parts, basal lamina and reticular lamina. The basal lamina is an oozy glue that comes out of the epithelial cells. And the reticular lamina is oozy reticular fibers coming out of the connective tissue. So both the epithelial cells of the epithelial tissue and the connective tissue, they want to be together. So they both provide their own glue, which provides a nice tight connection between the basement, that is a nice connection between the two different types of tissue. So the basal membrane is made up of the basal lamina, made by the epithelial tissue, and the reticular lamina, which is made by the connective tissue. Okay, the third characteristic we're going to talk about are glands. Now, the epithelial tissue is going to be producing and secreting lots of different things into the space around them. And so that means that we have two different types of glands. We have endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Endocrine glands are going to be multicellular and they're ductless. We'll talk about that in a second. And endocrine glands produce hormones, put hormones into the space, and it ends up going through the bloodstream. So eventually, everything will enter into the blood. This is really important. So endocrine cells make hormones. Those hormones go into the blood and then move around the body through the bloodstream. You will study the endocrine system in 232. The other type of gland, major type of gland, are the exocrine glands. And exocrine glands are going to be made up of cells that are going to produce a substance. That substance is going to end up in a duct, a tube, and then it will be delivered to a specific area of the body. So exocrine glands produce and secrete their stuff, whatever that stuff is, and then that stuff ends up in going through a duct and ending up in the right place. There are three different types of exocrine glands that we're going to talk about. I don't care about this slide, so you can just ignore it if you want to. This is the organization of the exocrine gland structure. What I want you to know is exocrine glands are made up of cells. All of the cells are producing and secreting things that will end up in a large duct, a larger tube, and then that large tube will deliver things to the right place. An example of this is the mammary glands. Mammary glands make milk. So there's lots and lots of different cells that are making milk. The milk is going to go into tubes, which then go into the largest tube, which is the mammary duct. And then the baby is able to drink from the duct through the nipple. Okay, so that's an example of an exocrine gland and things moving through a duct. So there are three different types of exocrine glands that you are responsible for knowing: the merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. So all those three different types of exocrine glands just describe how the cells release whatever they're secreting. So the first is the merocrine glands. The merocrine glands are going to exocytose their components. An example of this is the mucin glands. So remember, that's the goblet cells. Goblet cells are the ones that make mucin or mucus, okay? So mucus, sweat glands, salivary glands, these are going to all be merocrine glands, which means that they exocytose. So this picture here, which is really small, is showing us the merocrine gland. A merocrine gland, so if I have my cell here, like this, I'm going to have an exocrine gland. I'm going to have whatever's inside this space is going to be exocytosed. Remember, it's puking things up. Remember exocytosis? It's when a vesicle ends up at the cell membrane and then opens up and releases its fluids. So that's the Merocrine glands. The apocrine glands are going to have vesicles, and the whole vesicle is going to be released. So instead of exocytosis, which is when a vesicle opens and releases everything, here we're going to have a vesicle go up to the surface, and then the whole vesicle is released. That is in the second part of this picture, which maybe you can see it or not, but you see a vesicle full of fluid is going to and proteins is going to just get sloughed off its whole entire self. So the vesicle full of fluid is going to be released. This is how mammary glands work. So milk is produced. It's not exocytosed. Milk is produced, put into little vesicles, and then the vesicle is going to go into the duct, and then the babies will drink lots and lots of vesicles full of milk. All right, the last kind of exocrine gland are the holocrine cells. This is a cell that, or this is not a common method of exocrine release. This type of release is going to kill the cell. All of the proteins, whatever you're trying to put together, is going to be packed into a vesicle, and then the cell is going to explode, dying and releasing all the vesicles. So apocrine glands release vesicles, but the cell stays alive. In holocrine exocrine glands, the cell is just going to explode, releasing all of the vesicles. So that cell has to be replaced. The only example of a holocrine gland that you need to know are sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are oil glands on the skin. So the thing that makes a zit, that is a sebaceous gland. So the cells, we have lots of cells, and they are producing oil for the skin. Every time they make oil for the skin, they die. So you are constantly having new cells replacing the old cells every time you have oil, and you always have oil on your skin. And it's a good thing. It's just, this is the way that this type of secretion works. So you have endocrine glands, which make hormones. Those hormones are released into the bloodstream and do not use a duct. Then you have exocrine glands. Exocrine glands release fluids into a duct. We can release the fluid by exocytosis, just direct exocytosis, where the vesicle opens at the cell membrane. We can do it as apocrine, which is where we release an entire vesicle, which is mammary glands, or holocrine, where we make lots and lots of vesicles, fill them up with good juicy bits, and then the cell just explodes, releasing all those vesicles. All right. The next characteristic we want to talk about are the membranes. So membranes are throughout the body. We talked about that in the last chapter when we talked about cavities, and we talked about the serous membranes. Now we want to talk in general more about the other types of membranes that we'll find throughout the body. The first type of membrane is called the cutaneous membrane, and that is your skin. That is the largest organ that you have. We call the cutaneous membrane an organ, and that is the largest organ that you actually have, your skin. Okay, because it covers all of your entire body. It is external. We will learn a ton about that in the next chapter. Then you have two internal membranes that you're going to bump into, mucous membranes and serous membranes. So mucous membranes line your digestive tract, line your urinary tract, your respiratory tract, and your reproductive tract. Think about anywhere where you have mucus. And you don't think, like, I think a lot of us think of mucus as in something that you cough up, you know, like, and spit out maybe. That's kind of gross. Mucus that would be in your respiratory tract. You do have a gooey ooey that's supposed to be collecting pathogens and coming out of you and getting those pathogens out of you. That's in your respiratory tract. But you also have mucus in your digestive tract. Think about when you throw up and you have mucus in there. Think about when you poop. Around your poop, you have mucus. So mucus lines your digestive tract. Mucus is also going to be around your urinary tract. We don't see mucus coming out of our urinary tract very often, but it's going to be in our urinary system, and it's also in the reproductive tract. So a female has mucus in her vagina, and that helps with sex, but it also helps with reproduction. Okay, so the mucous membranes are going to be individual cells, usually globule cells, and they are going to be secreting mucus on a surface. So here's my goblet cell, and it's producing mucus, and the mucus lines this whole thing. So in your stomach, you have a mucus lining that covers all the cells and helps to protect those cells from the acid that's also going to be produced. Okay, as an example. Serous membranes we mentioned when we were talking about body cavities, and you make serous fluid that fills up those serous membranes. The serous membranes are made up of simple squamous epithelium, so they're really, really thin, and they are going to be producing those individual cells. These squamous cells are producing serous fluid. That serous fluid is going to fill up those bags, like the one around your heart, the pericardial cavity. That pericardium is going to be full of pericardial fluid, and every time your heart beats, it's going to be cushioned and protected from friction and movement by that serous fluid. Okay, so that's it for this video. We have one more video for chapter 5, but we talked about 4 major characteristics of tissues, mostly epithelial tissues. We talked about cell junctions. We talked about basement membrane. We talked about glands, and then we just talked about membranes. So I will see you in the next video when we are all finished with chapter 5.